Poland's foreign minister says Washington needs to do more to boost Ukraine's capabilities against Russia. Radoslaw Sikorski met the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Warsaw. Sikorski said Ukraine should be given permission to use long-range weapons to strike deeper inside Russia. Washington has been hesitant because of concerns over how Moscow would react. Well, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned against a decision to allow long-range missiles to strike Russian territory. He says it would turn the conflict in Ukraine into a wider war between Russia and Ukraine's allies.
It's not about whether to allow the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It's about deciding whether NATO countries are directly involved in the conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing less than a direct involvement of NATO countries, the US and the European countries in the war in Ukraine. It will change the nature of the conflict. It will mean that the NATO, US and European countries are at war with Russia.
Okay, let's speak to Diesen, who's a professor for international relations at the University of Southeast Norway, joining us from Oslo. Mr. Diesen, good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. So, strong words from Putin. What do you read into his comments?
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly serious because I think it's already quite obvious that NATO is deeply involved already in this war in terms of the war planning, supplying weapons, training, intelligence, target selection, mercenaries. They might even be involved in pulling the trigger as they manage some of these complex weapon systems. And of course, the support for the invasion of Russian territory was also quite severe. So it's worth keeping in mind that back in 2 years ago, Biden warned that sending F-16s could trigger World War III. So now, obviously, as the US now will approve perhaps long-range missile strikes deep inside Russia using US weapons and intelligence, it's simply seen as one step too far for Russia. So even if Putin would be not wanting to retaliate, it's building up a lot of pressure on him because they can't simply be seen as accepting these attacks on Russian territory by NATO and not retaliating. So there's a huge pressure in Russia to restore its deterrence.
I'm glad you bring up the F-16s because Moscow in the past, in fact, just this past July, threatened a response when NATO partners did send these F-16 jets to Ukraine. So NATO countries will now be paying close attention to the latest comments from Putin, won't they? How will this play out?
Yeah, and that's the great dilemma that the Russians are facing, because if they do strike back at NATO, then we might have World War III or a nuclear exchange. However, if Russia does not retaliate, then its deterrence is weakened and NATO is seen to be emboldened. As you suggested, what we learned from the past, given that Russia didn't retaliate, well, at least sufficiently, as the Western media suggest, Russia doesn't defend its red line, which means Russia's bluffing, which means that NATO can escalate even further. So, but of course, there's an end to this at some point, because as the crisis escalates more and more, the way Russia sees it, the risk of not doing something becomes much greater than actually doing something. So
publicly,
I think
there's been no announcement of any decision being made yet on publicly. But behind the scenes, what do you think is going on? Because earlier this week, Blinken said that the U.S. will continue to adapt its policy as the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine changed. Has it changed?
Yes, it changed dramatically. I think it's quite evident now over the past few weeks that this war of attrition has reached a very critical stage in which now the Ukrainian front lines are beginning to collapse. So the dilemma for NATO is, does it negotiate or escalate to keep the war going? And it seems as if some are pushing for negotiations while others are pushing for escalation. So this is why the United States is a bit cautious, because it should be, because if they escalate this war too much, they might not be able to negotiate anymore. And also it's the loss of unintended consequences, as at some point Russia will retaliate.
Look, speaking of escalation, I mean, if you listen to at least the UK Foreign Secretary and what he had to say earlier this week as well, he suggested that Iran's alleged dispatch of ballistic missiles to Moscow, which was revealed this week, he said was a significant and dangerous escalation. To what extent do you think that has played a role in changing the strategic thinking in London and Washington, if that thinking has changed?
It could be, but again, this might turn things on its head because we keep saying that Russia doesn't respond to NATO escalations, but this is to some extent a response. Keep in mind that since, for example, invasion of Kursk, we see when the Russians having more heavy bombing, the Russians threaten to supply weapons to American adversaries such as Iran and North Korea. We see the Russian warships in the Caribbean, but also now this air defense systems being sent to Iran. And if the reports are correct, Iranian ballistic missiles coming to Russia. So this is a form of horizontal escalation where instead of attacking directly on American troops, which would make it impossible almost to avoid World War III, they're looking at a way to escalate in other areas to bring some pain to America as a punishment for its escalation in the Ukraine proxy war. So the feeling in Moscow, from what I hear, is that the US and NATO isn't getting the message that Russia will retaliate. So it might be that this is not enough. And then instead of having horizontal escalation, they would have to have some kind of direct response.
Okay, thank you so much, Glenn Diesen. We thank you for joining us from Oslo.
Oh, my pleasure.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.